Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name's Tim, I'm Mr. Gomb's son, and I am a junior doctor, and I've been working in the NHS now for about 3.5 years, having qualified in 2020. And I'm going to talk a bit about medicine, a bit about what it's like applying to medicine, what it's like studying medicine, and what it's like to practice medicine. And I'm not a university college tutor. I'm not from the applications body. So there'll be some bits that aren't covered or aren't up to date because it's uniquely my experience. But I'd hope that over the sort of next half an hour to 45 minutes or so, I will, if you're on the fence about studying medicine, I will try and convince you to go on to the other side. And if you're still already in that paddock, then I will hopefully give you some tips and tricks on how to make your application successful, and hopefully one day you'll be standing in a similar position to me. So I'm going to talk about my journey into medicine, some interview tips. There'll be some chance for questions throughout, so please do feel free to ask any questions at any time. There's no such thing as a stupid question, and I'm always so happy to say some things that I might have missed or might correct. Hi guys, do you want to come and take a seat? And there'll be some time for questions at the end. If there are questions that you don't want to ask in front of your friends, then feel free to stay later on and you can just have a chat to me, or I'll leave my email address at the end, so you're always more than welcome to shoot me an email. So who am I? My name is Dr. Timothy Gomb. I'm a surgical teaching fellow at University College Hospital in London. I graduated from the University of Southampton from I joke saying it's the class of COVID-19, because I went out of the frying pan and into the fire, as some might say, starting practicing medicine sort of at the first trough of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I qualified with a Bachelor of Medical Sciences and a Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery from the University of Southampton. As my job title suggests, I'm interested in surgery. I always, when people ask me what I want to do when I grow up, I sort of say I want to be a colorectal surgeon, and no one really understands why I'd want to deal with people's bottoms for the rest of my life. But it's an area of medicine that I find really interesting, as well as paediatric surgery and possibly transplant surgery. I'm passionate about medical education, which is one of the reasons why I'm here, and also really interested in the nuances of medical ethics. I'm a Reading FC fan, which is really, really hard at the moment, and I undertook my medical elective in Tonga in the South Pacific, which I'll talk a bit more about later on. So disclaimer, medicine is changing as a career. It is something that I can guarantee that the NHS that I stand in and work in this weekend and again tomorrow is probably going to be a completely different NHS to the one that you will go and work in if you become doctors. And the career of doctor is changing. It's gaining responsibility and it's losing responsibility. There's pay erosion, as you might have seen in the news. There's professional undermining and government apathy, which has meant that it's at times really, really challenging to be a doctor. But I can assure you that it's still an incredibly rewarding profession. I can assure you that I love my job. It's really hard. I don't like waking up at 5 a.m, but it's really rewarding when you see the change that you make to people's lives. And if I was to go back to where you guys are, which would have been for me about 2013, and ask me, do you want to do it all again? I think 100 times over, I would say yes. As I said, my experience in medical school is probably very different to what you guys will go through, but I hope that I have some common knowledge and common experience that I can share. So why medicine? So for me, I've had a fascination with biology and the human body from a young age, which was quite aside from what my family were like, because I grew up from a long line of engineers in my family. My father is engineering trained, my father's father is engineering trained, my brother's an engineer now. So for me to kind of buck that trend was very against the current, but I was always fascinated with the way things work, the way the human body works, why we get ill, why our heart pumps and delivers blood to our lungs, and how oxygen gets around the body. But also fundamentally, when I was 15, my mother was incredibly unwell. Fortunately enough, I've been able to see her recovery from her admission to A&E through to the emergency surgery that she had, to her long and sort of prolonged recovery. But I saw lots of different healthcare professionals work together and form a chain where each individual forms a link in that chain, and each person is able to celebrate and excel in their particular skill, whether that's in the A&E doctors who diagnosed her with a brain hemorrhage, whether that's the neurosurgeons who did her emergency operation at 3 a.m, whether that's the intensive care doctors who got her out of her period of sepsis, whether or not it's the physiotherapists who were able to return her to her mobility, whether it was the occupational therapists. The NHS is full of fantastic individuals who thrive within a particular niche. And I saw that, and I saw a niche that I liked, that I wanted, that I thought that I could thrive in, and decided at a really young age, at about 15, which when you think about it is a completely bizarre time to make decisions about the rest of your life. Like, you think 15, most people are still going through puberty at that time, so to make decisions that shape the rest of your life is completely incredible a thing to do. But at that time it was what I wanted to do. And I saw the experience that patients had and their families, and the way that the doctors cared not only for the patient but also for the family, and thought, yes, that's what I want to do. I love a problem and task focused career where you can make real world results, and you can kind of, through medicine, give life back to those that are losing it, and you can see a problem and you can impart your skills and your knowledge to help fix that problem. And that's something that I really enjoy. But how did I get into med school? I had this idea when I was 14 that I wanted to be a doctor. And it's, you think sort of we joke the best laid plans of mice and men, and we think, oh, how on earth am I going to get from this idea that I had to starting a career about 10 years later? And it takes conviction. You have to really want it. The fact that you guys have stayed after school, and the fact that some people will be watching this talk again back online, kind of suggests that you already do want it. The fact that you're here on a sunny Tuesday afternoon before the weather gets really dark and cold suggests to me that you already have that seed that's sowed in your heads. You have to sort of devise a personal statement. I'm sure you've already got lots of things that you're doing outside of school, outside of your studies, outside of the sort of 8 to 3. And that can include extracurricular activities such as sport, or it can include volunteering and work experience. And they're really fantastic things that show to a university admissions team that you are more than just a student. You're more than just someone who comes to school and goes home. And you're someone who's interested, you're someone who's passionate, and you're someone who's caring. Grades, I've put in inverted commas because I don't think grades are as important as they were when I was going to be a doctor. That potentially is quite a hot take, and actually is something quite controversial. But medicine is changing in that it's no longer the profession of public school educated white men, and it's actually changing into something that's widely accessible to so many people of so many different backgrounds and experiences and education levels. And actually, just because you might not necessarily be an A-star student doesn't mean you can't do medicine. And there are so many different ways in, and I think that's really, really, really good and really fantastic for the profession. You also finally need to be determined. I've realised that applying to medicine pretty much occupies almost the entirety of your time in sixth form. You go from getting your GCSE grades and being like, great, I've got what I need, to all of a sudden going to universities, to going to courses, to preparing for these silly exams that unfortunately you have to sit because that's how they decide how you get into medical school. And it takes a lot of determination, it takes a lot of steel will. But actually, as I mentioned, it's something that's still incredibly rewarding. So as I mentioned, my journey started when I was in 2012, when I decided that I wanted to be a doctor when I was all grown up. I then sort of shortly started some work experience. I think, if I can remember, I had some work experience organised to me through school, which I was very fortunate about. I spent some time at a GP and at the drop-in centre in Reading. And I also then sort of had a part-time job throughout sixth form at a pharmacy that not only gave me a bit of cash, but also helped me to understand a bit more about secondary care, a bit about primary care, a bit about how healthcare is delivered in the community, and to sort of see that side that gave me stuff to talk about at interview. I went to some open days just before 2014. I remember long drives to Cardiff and Exeter, and some universities I didn't go and visit because my parents didn't want to take me to Northern Scotland, and seeing places, seeing campuses, seeing non-campus universities, seeing places like Oxford, Cambridge that are very collegiate, and other places like Exeter that's kind of everyone's scattered throughout the city. And you'll find a university that is for you, and you'll find a place that where you can sort of think about being home. I sat my UK CAT, which is something that I'll come on to later. Applied in 2015, started at the end of 2015 and moved into halls of residence, and then 5 years later rather, in August of 2020 I started F1 at University Hospital in Southampton. I did all the conventional subjects. I applied to Southampton, Exeter, Cardiff and Bristol for medicine, and then had a backup which was biomedical sciences at Southampton. Had some interviews which were different structures in Bristol. I don't know if it still is, but I did a mini multiple interview, which is kind of like speed dating for interviews, where you have 5 minutes with different examiners and kind of just work your way, being asked loads of different questions, some about some healthcare topics, some about some ethics, some about why you like that university, some about your personal statement, and it's all over in a big rush and a flurry. Or there's other interviews like Southampton, which is a mixture of group and panel interviews, panel being the sort of more conventional, where you sit down with a couple of members of faculty and you talk through your personal statement, and group discussions, which we'll do some role play of a little bit later, where you're in a group like you are now and you just discuss something, you discuss a topic, you discuss an area of medicine, you discuss a question, and that you're being assessed for how you work with the group, not necessarily the answers that you provide. I had one offer, which was to go to Southampton. I thought Southampton was fine, but it was the only offer I'd had, so I just leapt at it. And I was so grateful to have that offer, and ended up really enjoying Southampton so much for the 5 years that I spent there, that I then spent 2 more in my F1 and F2. When you are fortunate enough to be selected to interview, I'm going to be optimistic. At that point, you will never be more likely to be a doctor than you ever have in your life. You have completely shattered the odds and you've made it. And now is the time to prove yourself to be more than just that piece of paper that the admissions tutors have had a look at. But in order to do that, you have to prepare. You need to know what to expect. What type of interview are they going to do? Is it panel, as I mentioned, where you'll just be sort of in the hot seat for half an hour? Or is it mini multiple, where every new station is a new opportunity to prove yourself and to flesh out your CV? You need to know your stuff. I will give you a sort of a list of essential reading and some topics, but it's really important to know what you're talking about, to be prepared and have practice answers that you can deliver. And you need to think about why you want to go to that university. Do you like the course structure? Do you like the city? Do you like the fact it's collegiate? Do you like the fact that it's campus-based and everyone is in the same place and you're going to have an opportunity to make friends there? So you've got to think about the merits and the pros and cons of each course. You need to know what you want to say. There are particular structures for your answers. Some questions, and having structure to your answer shows that you know and you've thought through what you want to say. So one example structure is the STAR structure, which stands for situation, task, action and result. And there'll be questions like, tell me about a time where you dealt with conflict, or tell me about a time when you demonstrated yourself to be a good leader or you made a difficult decision. And you're able to break down that question into so many different chunks and ways in which you're able to kind of show that you've thought this through and you know what you're talking about. And you need to know how to say it, and the only real way to do that is to practice. I'm sure the school is able to offer, Mr. Gom is nodding, able to offer practice interviews with the UCAS team and heads of year and science teachers, and even practice with your peers, with your friends who have also got interviews. I'd say don't fall into the trap of all of a sudden thinking that your friend is a competition. That's something that happened to me with one of my closest friends. We both had an interview at the same university, And it was a very awkward couple of weeks where he had his interview and then I had mine, and he just refused to really mention it in any way. But your friends are your friends, and they'll still be your friends even if you don't get into the same medical school, or even if you don't get into medicine at all. So help each other, be kind to each other, and remember that you're there for each other. So there's a couple of things that I put on here that are, I'd say, essential reading. I think it's really good to start early with getting your head around some medical books and medical literature and medical reading. Even if it's just the BBC News Health page, that's a really good way to get your head around topics that are current and topics that are currently in the news. I would recommend reading This Is Going to Hurt, just because it's really well written. I think it's better than the TV show. And I think it's a really useful way to have an idea about what being a doctor is like, albeit what being a doctor was like in 2004, but it gives you a bit more of an idea of what life is like as a doctor, and helps you to kind of get your head around what stuff might be asked at interview. I've got a document here called Good Medical Practice, which I only learned about at medical school, but it is the GMC, which is the General Medical Council's kind of guidelines about what they expect a doctor to be like, how they expect a doctor to behave, how they expect a doctor to kind of think and do, and what kind of attitude they expect doctors to possess. And it's really useful for the sort of ethical questions that will come up in interview, because it gives a kind of an idea about the thought process that doctors need to have, and particularly relating to different topics. And I've got this book here, which actually, if you're going to take anything away from this talk, I'd say this book, The Knowledge, Medical School Interviews and All You Need to Know, is my one real serious recommendation. I think it's available on Amazon for probably about like £10, but it talks you through the history of the NHS in really brief, understandable topics. It gives you an introduction to public health. It has an excellent bank of practice questions. And I'd say if you use anything to prepare for interviews, use this book, The Knowledge, by Dr. Mona Cooper. The BMJ, which is the British Medical Journal, provides really cheap subscriptions to prospective medical students as well as medical students, and that has really concise, interesting current journal articles in that could be the topic of discussion at interviews. And also as I mentioned, keep your mind on stuff that's sort of hot in the press. Particularly, we've gone through a global pandemic with COVID-19, and there is no end of discussion that can come out of COVID-19. Whether it's the development of vaccines, whether it's public health strategy pertaining to lockdowns, whether it's sort of how the nuance of social distancing and transmission of viruses, just kind of having an understanding of more than just the general points of the COVID-19 pandemic would be really useful ammunition to have for interviews. And also other hot topics, particularly ethical debates surrounding sort of the start and the end of life, relating to doctors' pay, and also the wider role of the MDT and how different members of that fit in and play different roles. So this is what I'm gonna talk briefly about sort of the ethical scenarios discussion that happens in interviews, because they're not ones that necessarily are that easy to prepare for. So they are questions that aren't marked on what they say, it's kind of how you say it, and your ability to formulate an argument, your ability to look and see from both sides and be able to kind of understand the nuances of these topics. So there are 4 pillars of medical ethics that are important to understand. The idea of autonomy, which is a patient's right to self-govern. Non-maleficence, which is the idea of doing no harm. Justice, which is the fact that all the decisions we make have a consequence in the wider community. And beneficence, which is the idea of not just not doing harm, but the idea of actively doing good. And if you're able to draw on those principles and apply an understanding of those, you'll be able to leaps and bounds ahead of your peers when it comes to ethical discussions. And examples of ethical scenarios might be around giving consent, the idea of capacity, so is a patient able to make a decision and why? Organ donation and stuff like blood transfusions, and particular people, groups that might refuse or might accept them. So I think now is a good time. You've heard a lot of my voice, so I think now's a good time to have a little bit of a break and to kind of split into pairs or threes with the people that you're sat with and to practice an ethical scenario. So I've got 3 examples on the board. Not 3, I've got 5 actually. 5 examples on the board, and very conveniently we have a 3, a 3 and 3 2s. So very conveniently we have 5 different questions. So if you guys could amongst yourselves debate for and against the prescription charge in an NHS which is free at the point of service, should we still have to pay for prescriptions? If you guys want to talk about the for and against having to pay to see your GP and sort of in the particularity of how that works in an NHS that is supposedly free at the point of service. If you 3 want to talk about cosmetic surgery being available on the NHS, pros and cons and how that could work and whether it should or whether it shouldn't. If you 2 talk about whether smoking and alcohol dependency treatment should be available free on the NHS. And finally, you 3 at the back, if you want to talk about whether there should be mandated vaccines for healthcare workers. So like I don't know if you remember last year there was a political policy where all frontline health workers were mandated to get the COVID-19 vaccine. Yeah, so the idea of whether or not should healthcare workers have to get vaccines against cold, flu and transmissible diseases. So we'll take about 5 to 10 minutes and then we'll regroup and share what we found. I think everyone has been, from what I've heard, everyone's been having really interesting discussions. But shall we start with the gentleman in the middle? What you spoke about, should smoking and alcohol dependency treatment be free on the NHS? Have you got an argument for that and against that you'd be willing to share? You don't have to share, but just so that everyone can get an idea about what you guys were talking about in your group.
Yeah, for 4. Actually, against it could probably prevent future generations from smoking and drinking alcohol as much.
Yeah, it's fine.
And 4, so if people can't afford it, they can't get the treatment there. So they don't get the treatment, and the life expectancy rate goes down for them as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's very nuanced, isn't it? Because the idea that diseases like cirrhosis or liver failure related to alcohol excess and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease related to smoking, one could argue that it's self-inflicted. So one could argue, therefore, that it's then on the burden of the individual to pay for that care. But I think it's very right that if you do still give access to that care, then you can reduce smoking, you can reduce alcohol use, and you can actually include patient education into that as well. So there's no right or wrong answer in either way, and in fact there's no right or wrong answer about this for any of the questions. But what about cosmetic surgery being available on the NHS? What did you think?
Okay, I feel like it probably is necessary, like if you need like a skin graft or stuff like that to get into an accident. But against it's just like sometimes people can abuse it because it is like if you are mentally or physically affected by your own body that you can get free cosmetic surgery. But then also like body image issues and stuff should also be taken seriously. So
yeah, exactly, and it comes down to the reason behind it. It's a very good point that if you put a blanket ban on cosmetic surgery being available in the NHS, then does that cover plastic surgery as a consequence of major trauma? Or it's a very interesting point that you made touching on the mental health effect, because that's a very unseen effect of an unseen reason for having cosmetic surgery. So it's one of those, yeah, there's both sides to it and there's no right or wrong answer. At the back, you talked about mandated health vaccines for frontline health workers.
Like before.
Yeah, whichever you like.
Basically, they shouldn't have to be definite, because let's say if you don't want it, then they can't really force you. Because some people, like for the COVID vaccine thing, people are saying that's dangerous. So if you don't want it, then you shouldn't have to have it. But then you should have like a valid reason for it.
Yeah. And what about 4. Why did you guys come up with the reason why there should be mandated vaccines for healthcare workers?
I think if you're working with vulnerable people, in hospitals and stuff, or if you are the people that are giving out vaccines, then I think maybe you could really consider having it done, because I think it'll just make people feel safer.
Exactly, and I think both points have touched very interestingly in the interplay between autonomy and justice, in the idea that we look to preserve a patient's right to self-govern and to autonomy, but should that come at the expense of our, as a healthcare workers, right to autonomy and self-governance? But at the same time, should our right to self-governance come at the consequence to others? One could argue that it's selfish to put your thoughts and needs ahead of the vulnerable, ahead of people that you're coming into contact with. So again, another point that's incredibly nuanced. Second to last, we had having to pay to see your GP. What did you think?
So, if people pay to see your GP, the NHS can use the money to develop their services and
Exactly.
help the people who aren't able to afford the GP.
Exactly.
Also, you shouldn't have to pay to see your GP because it might deter some people from actually going to the GP for some issue that they might think is minor but could end up being major. And also, the NHS values, one of their core values is to provide service free at the point of entry, and when you go to your GP, it's your first interaction with a medical professional, and paying for it kind of goes against NHS principles.
Exactly, and it weighs into a similar argument about the use of the private sector with the NHS. Some people argue that the use of the private sector allows waiting lists to be cut in order to, because with people who have enough money who are able to go privately, allow for the queue to be debulked and for it to be reduced. But you're absolutely right in saying that if there was a mandatory fee, no matter how low, that will be enough to deter people with simple symptoms. If you think, I look at it through the lens of surgery and think, oh, someone noticed just a little bit of blood in their poo, and they're just like, oh, that's fine, that's just normal, that's just because I'm constipated. But actually it could potentially be an early sign of bowel cancer that they could miss, and it would be caught much later as a consequence of not wanting to pay. And finally, just to bring it into land, what were the thoughts about having to pay for the prescription charge or not?
I was going to say for against prescription charges. Some people might have an illness that they need a lot of prescriptions for, but it's not through their fault.
Yeah.
But they're going to have to pay a lot, and that's unfair on them if they have to pay that much. Maybe they can't afford it, and then they can't get the treatment, and then they'll have a worse life expectancy because of it.
Yeah, exactly. And what about for paying for prescriptions?
Well, it depends where the money goes, because I don't really know about much of it.
Yeah.
If it goes back to the NHS, then it just helps from the NHS. But I don't really have any points for.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because if you look at, I'm very grateful that we don't have a healthcare system like it is in the States, where you think that it's been a revolutionary idea that no one has to pay more than $25 a month for insulin, which is a life-saving medication for millions of people across the world. And actually there's certain drugs in the UK which you don't have to pay for, like insulin is one of them, stuff pertaining to diabetes, or thyroxine for people who have hypothyroidism. But actually it's a system where a lot of the fee goes to paying the licenses that are held for drugs by pharmaceutical companies. And actually the NHS pays billions every year in order to have access to these medications because they're so tightly held by big corporations. So some of that money is unfortunately going into their pockets, and also some of that money allows the NHS to provide medicines for free for people who come into hospital. So it's difficult because it's so interconnected that it's impossible to draw the line either way, which is why it makes it a fantastic discussion to have at medical school interviews. So just for the last couple of minutes or so, I'm going to talk a bit about what medical school is like. As I mentioned, went to the University of Southampton, which is a relatively campus-based university. It has the main Highfield campus, which is where I did a lot of my lectures in the first couple of years. But my time was also split up at University Hospital Southampton, which had some lecture theatres where I'd go a couple of times a week for tutorials and other lectures. Medicine is really hard. It is very contact hour heavy, with up to about 30 to 40 hours of lectures a week, which is made up for effectively 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, with the exception of Wednesday afternoons, which is an unwritten rule across every single university, that Wednesday afternoons are a sacred time for sport, which other activities are available, but as someone who loved football and found a love for lacrosse, that was really good. That 30 to 40 hours is split between tutorials and lectures and case-based discussions, but doesn't necessarily account for the time for private study. So I found that as the weeks drew on and as I got closer to exams, those hours were more and more and more, and I found my free time dwindling and dwindling and dwindling. So something I had to learn very early on was time management and be able to maintain a good work-life balance. Another thing that's really important at university is that as hard as you work, I think you have to play equally hard. I think whether that's making the most of the university experience, be that through freshers events, through that with your halls, through that to be sports and other societies, there are so many ways to flesh yourself out even more so as an individual at university. And it's a fantastic time between 18 and 23 to just grow so much as a person. I know my parents will agree that the person who left home at 18 and came back at 23 having finished university was almost completely different, because I had grown so much, and actually through becoming a doctor, that process encourages you to kind of flesh yourself out. There are other bits as well. There's great opportunities to partake in research, being able to sort of grow medicine further just through from grassroots levels, as well as leadership and volunteering. I was in my fourth year the captain of my lacrosse team, and that still in interviews today is fantastic fodder for talking about leadership and management and stuff like that. So medicine is normally 5 to 6 years, depending on what university you go to, with some universities having a very distinct preclinical and clinical split. I know the Oxbridge universities do that, I know UCL, I know a couple of the other sort of slightly more sciencey universities kind of split clinical and preclinical, and other universities like Southampton have a more spiralling curriculum where you have lectures a couple of days a week and then are in hospital to cement that learning at the earliest possible opportunity. Both have their merits. Both are fantastic ways of learning medicine. I'm of course a big advocate for the way in which I did it, which was a spiralling way, but other universities have a fantastic way of sort of integrating a master's into it. I know that sort of Oxbridge, everyone sort of comes out with a master's because of the natural split in clinical and preclinical, gives you an opportunity to do some extra research for yourself in the middle. But for me, the preclinical bit was my Bachelor of Medical Sciences, which was mostly lecture-based and exam-based, and then my Bachelor of Medicine and Bachelor of Surgery was almost exclusively placement, which I spent in hospital and GP practices doing a mixture of medicine, surgery, GP and other specialty placements. No two universities' experiences are the same, and everyone has an opportunity, as I mentioned, to flesh themselves out, and play hard means different to other people. Means different things to different people. I threw myself into sports and societies. I played football, lacrosse, I did charity netball games. I joined societies that pertained to my interests. So I joined the Christian Union. I joined Raise and Give, which every university has sort of like a charitable organisation. And I also joined specific medical societies, such as sort of paediatric society, because when I was at med school I wanted to be a paediatrician. You also get to get involved in the city that you live in. I think it's a really good thing to move away from home to go to university. You don't have to, and every family is different, and I don't want to prescribe a particular way of life to everyone's family circumstances. But I think moving away and throwing yourself into a different city and throwing yourself into living on your own and living with friends and developing yourself as a person is part of that university experience. And it is moving away from home at 18 was one of the things that I'm so glad that I did, because it helped me to grow into the person that I am today. There's also opportunities to do stuff at med school to enrich your CVs. I know you're probably not thinking about CVs. It's not something that one normally thinks about until deep into being a doctor and thinking, oh, why do I even need one? But actually, at university, you'll get a chance to be involved in research. I did a systematic review, which is a particular type of paper where you collate different types of information and present your findings. And I was fortunate enough to be able to present that at a conference in Prague, which, even looking back now, is, when I'm applying to specialty training, maximum points for particular things. So actually, that's something that I was grateful that I did at university. There's also a chance to build up a CV if you want to go and to do something called the Academic Foundation Programme, where if you're really interested in research, then you can integrate that into your foundation year 1 and year 2 training, and can take some time out to do some research amongst that. As I mentioned, there's also really good opportunities to partake in volunteering and leadership, be that inside or outside of medicine. So as I sort of draw into close, my tips to make the most out of university would be to move away if you can, but always stay in touch. Always stay in touch with your home friends, always stay in touch with your parents, where you're from, because it's always good to remember where you came from, what made you into the person you are, and helps for time for reflection. It's okay to not be okay, because it won't feel okay a lot of the time. You will feel so out of your depth at med school. You will feel like you have no idea what you're doing, and you'll feel like you want to just pack it in, because I know full well that I wanted to on 5 or 6 separate occasions. My dad's nodding at me. But that's okay, because it is new. It is a learning experience. It is terrifying at times, but you are there because you have earned it, as I mentioned at the bottom. Make friends with your imposter syndrome, because if you wear it like armour, it can never hurt you. And if you remember that you are where you are at medical school because you've worked hard, because you are intelligent, because you are driven, that in itself will help you to make you a better person and a better doctor. Be curious. Information is seldom learned passively, and no greater place to learn that is than at university, when all of a sudden you are in charge of your learning. You have lectures that you can attend, but no one's making you attend them. And actually having that desire to learn and to be curious and to gain more information will drive you through. And also the BMA, which is the British Medical Association, which I know is probably something you guys have been hearing a lot about in the media, probably from a very much more negative way than which I'm seeing them as a member. But I'd recommend getting a BMA membership early. I think it's free whilst you're at medical school and gives you fantastic opportunity to their library, so you never have to buy a single textbook in your life. So much like at medical school, never stop asking questions. If you have any questions, particularly about this talk, or you'd like some more information, or you'd like some interview tips, or more information about why I want to be a colorectal surgeon, then more than welcome to shoot me an email, or to shoot Mr. Gom an email, or to shoot your sixth form tutors or anything an email, because they will be able to have a lot of the information that you need. Email universities and just ask. Admission tutors do very little outside of the peak times, so do just shoot them an email, whether it's about the university, whether it's about the curriculum, whether it's because you've lost the prospectus and you want another copy. Email them and ask the questions, because you're not going to find out unless you ask. And ask the school to put you in touch with any current medical students or other alumni, because they'll be able to give you slightly more specific to this school answers about what they did and what worked and what didn't. Some resources are for sort of interview tips and NHS hot topics. I think the slides are going to be put somewhere sensible by Mr. Gom, so don't worry about writing those down, just go and find them in the slides. There are lots of different medical school podcasts, whether that's the Ward Round, whether it's the Theatre, which is a specific podcast produced by the Royal College of Surgery about topics related to surgical training, whether that's current affairs podcasts, which are the news agents, and the rest is politics, which are fantastic for giving you a different view on what's going on in life at the moment, or whether it's just relaxing podcasts like Kick It Forward, which is my favourite Australian Aussie Rules football podcast, or that Peter Crouch podcast, which is just a bit of silliness that I listen to. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Feel free to stay at the end to ask questions. Feel free to shoot Mr. Gom an email, or to shoot me an email, or just feel free to enjoy the rest of your afternoon.